Welcome back. A report out today says there's been a jaw-dropping fall in life expectancy in some of the poorest areas of England. Sir Michael Marmot, a top public health figure, warned that Boris Johnson's levelling up agenda would fail unless the divide was fixed. But what does levelling up actually mean? Here's the Prime Minister announcing the plans last year. The government says these plans, you're not hearing the Prime Minister announcing those plans for reasons I can't explain, but there you go, I'll just carry on. The government says these plans will make things fairer across the UK, and £4.8 billion has been set aside for it, regenerating town centres and upgrading local transport. They've also said it covers education and that no young person will be left behind, though we heard last week from the Education Committee that white working class students had been neglected and let down. So what's actually being done on the ground? Is the slogan turning into action? And does levelling up mean different things in different parts of the country? To find out, we've assembled a panel of guests. We've got Bronwyn Maddox, who's director of the Institute for Government, the think tank that aims to make government more effective. Alongside her, we have three political figures from corners of the country which may benefit from levelling up. Steve Rotherham is the Labour Mayor of Liverpool Metro. Liverpool's the fourth most deprived local authority in England, according to the government's deprivation index. Sir Roger Gale is the Conservative MP for North Thanet in Kent. Thanet as a whole is 34th out of the 317 local authorities measured. And Jamie Driscoll is the Labour Mayor for North of Tyne. 9.3% of North Tyneside residents live in neighbourhoods judged to be in the 10% most deprived in England. Bronwyn, perhaps I can start with you as our panel's non-elected member. What do you understand levelling up to mean?
It's a really good question, because we've heard lots of different things from different ministers, from the Prime Minister, indeed from the Treasury, from its plan for growth. But I think everyone can get the gist of it, which is that the government wants to do something about parts of Britain that, whether or not you call it left behind, that have not done as well as other parts. So to bring both opportunity and prosperity to them, bring jobs, bring education. There's a whole debate about whether that extends to health as well, levelling up health outcomes, but trying to do something about the inequalities and disparities that exist across the UK.
And how does it differ, Bronwyn, for my sake, this from, say, a socialist agenda, which is all about making sure that everyone starts on the same even ground, and then it's up to each of us to kind of pursue our opportunities?
Well, even though you define a socialist agenda that way, I think your phrasing of it might include more emphasis on opportunity than some would put. And so this government puts a lot of emphasis on equality of opportunity, as well as fair access to things like public services. But I think what it amounts to is a really targeted, or in theory, we haven't seen much yet, but a targeted blast of investment and attention at some parts of the country that have been struggling.
Steve, you're the Mayor of Liverpool Metro. It's been hovering in the top 5 most deprived local authorities since 2004, and we found out today that in neighbouring Manchester, life expectancy fell last year by 1.6 years for men and 1.2 years for women. So what does deprivation look like on the ground where you are, and has COVID exacerbated the situation?
I think for most areas in the country that have been left behind, COVID has only made things even worse. But it was interesting that Bronwyn said that everyone gets the gist of what levelling up is. And I think that's right. People know what making something more level is, but there's absolutely no evidence that that's taken place. And I'd say conversely, what we are seeing on the ground is an attempt by government to level down certain areas in the country, like the Liverpool City region, for instance, but also that the funding that you mentioned right at the start, in reality, is not finding its way to those areas that the government says it wants to help. And so levelling up for me is no more than sloganeering by a desperate Prime Minister.
Jamie, how about you? I mean, what's the biggest inequality in your area, but how do you respond also to Steve?
What we really need, Mariella, is to create loads of jobs. That's what we've been doing. I've been in power for 2 years. We have a target creating 10,000 jobs over 30 years set by the Treasury. So by now I should be on 700 jobs. I'm actually on 4,200, because everybody knows if you get good jobs, well-paid jobs, that is one of the major determinants of how kids grow up, of the wealth in the region, of people's life expectancies. And that investment needs to come through. We can do it on a local level in a way that's very hard nationally. So the current thing, like the Levelling Up Fund, yes, I'm well aware there's deprived areas across the country, but unless these are targeted locally in a way that we can strategically work things together, we're not going to see the changes. Otherwise it's going to be vanity projects, basically scattered around for marginal seats.
Mm. Well, what are the things that look unfair to you, though, when you see it in comparison either with the rest of the country or against more affluent areas, perhaps? I mean, is it job opportunities? You talked a bit about them, but also surely things like access to good, affordable or free schools, failing infrastructure or public transport that limits people's access to opportunities. I mean, there are so many levels on which, levelling up needs to take place, aren't there?
You're dead right. If you look at somewhere like London, where there's a transport system where you can get a bus, an integrated transport system, I don't even live in London, I think it's £1.20 the ticket. You try and get a bus in where I live, where Steve lives, and we don't have the same levels of subsidy and funding. And we haven't had the investment for a long, long time. It's regularly the case that the per capita investment in London is 5 times what you get in the northeast. And that's across the board. That's what's got to change if we want to level up. You can't level up with concrete. It needs things like revenue, like bus services, like the investment in skills and education.
What do you feel about the phrase itself? Is it helpful or not? I mean, is it helpful that it's on the tip of our tongues?
It's got it on the agenda, and that's good. You would like to think that because the Prime Minister was previously a Metro Mayor, he would understand this, but we've seen more centralisation than we have investment. But I'm speaking to government pretty much every day, trying to get us extra deals, extra powers coming through. If we can do that, it'll work. But you can't level up the English regions from Whitehall. You have to be able to do it on the ground.
Sir Roger, what's the picture like in North Thanet?
I think we have to take account of the fact that everybody assumes that the southeast is automatically affluent. It isn't. There are pockets of deprivation in the southeast, as there are pockets of deprivation in the northeast and the northwest. And if we're going to level up, then that doesn't mean levelling up north. It means levelling up north and south and west, actually, because there are pockets of deprivation in the West Country as well. In Thanet, we've got at the moment, we're running at somewhere between 7 and 8% unemployment. That's partly, of course, due to the pandemic and the loss of seasonal jobs, which have just been devastated. But it's a deep-seated malaise. We're on a peninsula. We're lacking in investment, and we're most certainly lacking in job opportunities. And what I have been trying to do for a very long time, and still am, is to encourage the investment into East Kent, the peninsula of East Kent, that will create the jobs. Because otherwise what we're going to do, and what I'm afraid the government is trying to do, is to smother us in houses for people from London to come and live in with no jobs. And that will simply exacerbate the situation. What we need is what we're trying to achieve at the moment, which is the reopening of a major airport. That will then create a lot of jobs. But we do need the infrastructure to go with it.
The way you describe it, Sir Roger, this is something that needs to happen all across the country. I mean, in specific areas perhaps, but all across the nation. So is there not any virtue to a national programme to address it? And how would you go about spreading the money from Westminster, from London outwards in a way that isn't happening yet, perhaps?
I think I agree. I'm not sure if it was Steve or Jamie that was speaking when I heard it, because I'm afraid I had technological gremlins that delayed my joining you. But I think it's right that we need to get stuff out of London. And that doesn't just mean moving bits of Whitehall out to Birmingham or Manchester. I regard that as tokenism. But what it does mean is local control. And the more local control we have, and the more resources are put into giving us the tools to do the job with locally, I think the better the results will be. I don't have great faith in Whitehall, never have had under any administration of any political party, in the idea that centralisation is always good. I don't think it is.
I wonder if you could each, and I'll start with you, Steve, just identify the things that you feel are most imperative in order to achieve levelling up in your area.
I'd say the two big issues for us are one that Jamie's touched on, which is a public transport system that we are able to integrate, because at this moment in time it's so fragmented with what happened with deregulation on the buses, for instance, and we know that our rail system is in dire need, and even this government have identified the requirements and the need for us to do more on rail. But skills is a huge one, and there are only areas where there are devolved administrations and metro mayors really that have the purview over the whole agenda. So at a strategic level, we can look at economic investment opportunities, what the potential growth sectors might be, where therefore there are skills shortages and skills gaps, and then using some of our funding to identify how we can then best fill those requirements and invest our money from central government, of course, from taxpayers, to get a better return for our local economies, but also for UK PLC. That's the only way it can happen. And Jamie's right, it can't happen by Whitehall doing things to us. It has to be working with us, and then we can get a better return for everyone.
Jamie?
Well, Steve's right in identifying those two things. Roger's absolutely correct that it's about investment and getting investment in these places. But the way you have to do that is, if you're wanting to land big companies, as I have successfully, then you need to have the transport system, or their confidence that you're going to fix the transport system, and the skills for the skilled workforce. And so that requires all of these separate government, central government departments to be working together. So that's the advantage of the Metro Mayor model. You actually have someone in an area who can pick up the phone to central government and say, look, can you get around the table? But it needs the will from government to do that. So the more that they devolve, the more we can tie things together locally. That's the only way it's actually going to work.
Would you like to see more devolvement, Sir Roger?
Yes, but I think to some extent I understand what Jamie's saying. Metro mayors are fine in metropolitan areas, but metro mayors don't work in rural areas. And of course, a lot of the south and the southeast and the southwest are rural. You can't really have, I suppose you could, but you wouldn't really want a Kent mayor. I think what I would like to see is more unitary authorities.
Yes, you could empower local councils more, though, couldn't you?
Well, you need the economy of scale. And if we could, this is a heresy in terms of a lot of Kent County councillors who are my friends, but nevertheless, if you could create two more unitary authorities in Kent, there's one already, which is Medway, then you might get the kind of local government scale. But that will only work if you decentralise, allow the proper cooperation between Whitehall and local government that allows local government to get on and to do locally what local does best.
You're listening to Mariella Frostrup on Times Radio. We're talking about levelling up and whether it's more than a slogan and what needs to be done. Bronwyn, it's been a slogan for quite some time now. So has it already started? Has levelling up already started? Is this money being handed out to fix the problems that we've been hearing about?
I think so. Some of it has simply been announced, but coronavirus did come charging in and really knock this completely off course, it seems to me. We were talking right at the beginning of this interesting discussion about metrics in the jargon, how you measure this. And I think it's really important that the government gets hold of a set of ways of measuring this. Otherwise, it's going to be vulnerable to people saying, oh, you're just putting money there because you need to prop up that constituency. You're just doing it there for political reasons. What about this one? And that has to be a temptation in all this. So they do need a way of measuring it, but an awful lot of these metrics are going to have gone the wrong way in the past year because of coronavirus. So I think we need to judge almost a year from now. It's just sort of starting. We've been talking about, moving civil servants out. And I completely agree. I think it was Roger saying, look, this is just a kind of window dressing. It may well have, inject a bit of vitality and a new perspective into those Whitehall departments, but it's complete confusion of, say, you just take bits of central government and plonk them around the country. That's not the same thing as moving power and money out into the hands of local people. for. But there is a real, problem in deciding where the money goes. And I don't think they've really done that yet.
And it is a point, Steve, isn't it, that there's been a lot of talk about government investing money in areas where they either wanted to win seats or keep seats. And there's very little that can be done to prevent that happening.
Yeah, it's the worst part of pork barrel politics that you can see demonstrated, because the pretext to all this is that there's supposedly got to be this belief that we can level things up. And despite devolution, and we've got limited devolution in our areas, myself and JB, and even Andy and others, we are still the most politically centralised democracy in the OECD, and we have the most unbalanced economy in Europe with huge regional disparity. And I get what Sir Roger's talking about with the sort of inter-regional disparities that exist. He's absolutely right about that, and we need to do something to address that. But levelling up the government's agenda is about trying to get money to those areas that for decades, perhaps even for generations, have been left behind, and given us a fair crack of the whip and the opportunity to optimise what the latent potential in those areas is. And that's why, working with governments, we can see a return back to Treasury. It's not about grants, it's about investment, and it's about ensuring that we can maximise the huge opportunities in geographical areas like the Liverpool City region.
Interesting. We just heard from a listener, Lucian, who says low-cost, free, high-quality broadband is the best purchase for the pound to level up. You've probably got a point there. But Bronwyn, why are regional disparities in the UK so much greater than comparable countries?
I'm not sure that they always are. They are pronounced, but it's a problem in many countries, and it's a problem that goes back decades. You could even say centuries. It's a very, very hard problem to shift. Basically, often investment, whether public investment or private investment, gravitates to areas of success, making them more successful. And in government terms, it's easier to put money where there's already success because you appear to get a much greater return on it. So it's a hard problem to shift. It's hard to create jobs where there isn't infrastructure and a whole buzz around a place.
Yeah.
People have been at it for decades.
I wondered, Jamie, if that's the issue. I mean, you're mayor for North of Tyne. We can't really talk about levelling up, can we, without mentioning the North-South divide, which would seem to be partly what Bronwyn's referring to there. Is that the main inequality that needs addressing still, do you feel? I mean, Sir Roger's put in a very good word for the southern parts of the country as well.
I think it's less north versus south than centre versus regions. Yes, by every measure you don't want to be top of, the northeast is lowest life expectancy, lowest business density, all of these problems. But the way that they need to be solved is, as Bronwyn's alluding to, about investment, about long-term strategic investment with someone who can fight your corner. If we can do that, now, the way, for example, I've smashed my jobs target out of the park by a factor of 6, but I don't get any more funding. If you're a corporation and you're doing that, they would be investing heavily in you. That's what government needs to be doing, is where local areas, and it's a huge rural area, the North of Tyne as well, it's much bigger than Kent. That's the answer to this, is get local people who know their areas to come up with the strategic plans and invest heavily in them.
Jamie's just given me his answer, which is very useful because we're coming to the close of this. Steve, can you offer me an answer?
In regards to the Liverpool City region?
And how you achieve levelling up and whether it's even a thing.
Well, I don't think it's a thing, honestly. I think it's just another form of words by the governments to try to attract those people in the red wall seats to continue to lend their vote. But it's no more than that. The reality is that if levelling up was to be at the centre of what the government wanted to achieve, then the funding, and you mentioned about £4.6 billion, by the way, of which only about £600 million was available in the first year, which is a drop in the ocean across the whole country. And with the beauty contest that surrounds it, where it has to be supported by a local MP, And where is that funding primarily going? Surprise, surprise, to Tory MPs who have links with central government. But if it was serious about levelling up, what you would do is you would look at opportunities where you can get the maximum return on that investment. So pick some winners, put some money into those things, give the geographical areas, no matter whether they've got a metro mayor or not, the opportunity to do things, and then you can start to genuinely level up, not just the economy, but also the prospects for those areas.
Sir Roger.
Money's finite. We're lucky in one respect. In Margate, we have a town deal fund. It's a tiny sum of money in national terms, £22.5 million. But I've been absolutely adamant that whatever we spend it on, leave us at least as much again, and preferably twice as much again, in private investment, so that it's not just government handout being spent to do something. It's government investment being used to generate much, much more value for money. The other thing I'd like to see, and I'm not averse to high speed too, I want to see the link between North and South. We haven't built a new railway line for far too long. But I would like to see High Speed 1 finished first, because at the moment it takes from Margate to London on some trains about an hour and a half. It's actually slower than it was in 1929.
Oh my goodness. I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop you there, but I think you've illustrated very clearly one of the many things that needs to happen in terms of infrastructure. Thank you all very much for joining me today. This is Mariella Frostrup on Times Radio.